The late October sun hung low over Cleveland, casting long, bruised shadows across the manicured lawns of Edgewater Park. It was that specific time of year on the shores of Lake Erie when the air grew crisp enough to bite, carrying the scent of damp earth and the distant, metallic tang of the city's industrial heart. The city hummed with a far-off, mechanical rhythm. But here, among the weeping willows and the rocky shoreline, there was a fragile illusion of peace. Tourists in thick coats ambled along the winding paths, their breath puffing in small, white clouds, while locals hurried past, heads bowed against the chill wind. The leaves, a chaotic jumble of burnt orange and decay, skittered across the paved walkways like anxious things seeking shelter. Seated on an iron bench near the breakwater was a man who seemed carved from the same granite as the city's old foundations. Chief Petty Officer Cade Ryder Nolan was not a typical tourist. He was a man of hard angles and deliberate stillness. His dark hair was cut high and tight, and his flint-colored eyes scanned the perimeter with a habit forged over a decade in the Navy SEAL teams. He wore a simple gray jacket that concealed the coiled muscle beneath, blending into the crowd while simultaneously radiating an aura of stay away. At his feet lay Kaiser, a massive, regal German shepherd. Unlike the leaner, more agile Malinois often seen in police work, Kaiser was built for power and endurance, with a sable and gold coat and a large, noble head. Kaiser was not a pet, nor was he retired. He was a decorated military working dog, an active duty combat asset currently on mandatory leave with his handler. They were a team that had breached compounds in the Middle East, now forced through a period of decompression that felt more stressful than the missions themselves. Kaiser's dark, intelligent eyes observed the world with a placid calm, his body relaxed but ready to explode into violence on a single command. Across the paved path, the target of Cade's peripheral observation was not a threat, but a splash of vivid color in the gray afternoon. Clara Mae Thompson sat in a slightly dated motorized wheelchair, her easel set up to capture the light hitting the Cleveland skyline across the water. She was a striking woman in her mid-20s with unruly auburn hair pulled back in a messy bun that allowed loose strands to frame a pale but fiercely, quietly beautiful face. Her hands, stained with charcoal and pastel dust, moved with fluid grace. She looked fragile, at a glance. A longer look revealed the set of her jaw and the intensity of her focus. She was painting the landscape, but she also sold small sketches to passers-by, a modest enterprise that seemed to be her way of claiming space in a world that often overlooked her. The scene's tranquility was broken by a shift in the atmosphere that Kaiser picked up instantly. The shepherd's head snapped up, a low growl vibrating in his deep chest. Cade followed the animal's gaze. 3 uniformed police officers were approaching Clara's position, their body language broadcasting more arrogance than authority. Leading the pack was Sergeant Doyle, a man whose physical presence was as oppressive as a humid night. He was thick-set with a doughy face and eyes that were too small for his head, currently narrowed in a look of casual malice. Flanking him were 2 subordinates who looked like eager jackals. Officer Peterson, tall and lanky with a nervous tic, and Officer Grimes, short, stocky, and perpetually smirking. Cade watched, his body still perfectly immobile, while his mind shifted from rest to assessment. Doyle stopped directly in front of Clara, his shadow falling across her canvas. "Ma'am," Doyle said, his voice loud enough to carry, dripping with a false politeness. "We've had a complaint, unlicensed soliciting, blocking a public throughway, creating a nuisance." Clara stopped painting. She didn't flinch, though her knuckles were white where she gripped the armrests of her chair. "I have a permit, Sergeant. It's clipped to the edge of my bag, and I'm not blocking the path." Her voice was quiet but steady. Doyle chuckled, a wet, unpleasant sound, and kicked lightly at her wheel. "I don't see a permit, Peterson." "You see a permit?" The tall officer shook his head, grinning. "No permit, Sarge. Just trash cluttering up the park." Doyle leaned closer, invading her personal space. The smell of stale coffee and aggression rolled off him. "This park is for decent folks. They don't want to see this." He gestured vaguely at her legs, reducing her existence to an eyesore. "Pack up your little art project and roll on back to whatever hole you crawled out of." Clara looked up at him, her eyes blazing. "I have every right to be here. Please leave me alone." The refusal seemed to snap something in Doyle. He was holding a large paper cup of steaming coffee in one hand. "You think the rules don't apply to you because you're in that chair?" He took a step. "Pay the fine, cash, right now." Clara shook her head. "I don't have any cash." Doyle's eyes went cold. "Oops," he said. "Clumsy." He tilted his hand. The lid of the coffee cup popped off and the dark, steaming liquid poured out. He aimed it with a vicious precision right at the footrest of her wheelchair, splashing the hot liquid over her boots and the edge of the blanket that covered her legs. Clara gasped, instinctively trying to recoil, but her body didn't respond. The heat soaked through the wool. "So clumsy of me," Doyle mocked. "Maybe that'll warm up your dead legs." He grabbed the handles of her wheelchair. "Grimes, help me tip this piece of junk over." A sound like a lion's roar ripped from Kaiser's throat. A bark so deep it vibrated with a physical pang in the chests of everyone nearby. The massive shepherd launched forward, covering the distance in 2 seconds. He planted himself between Doyle and Clara, the hackles on his back raised, teeth bared in a snarl that promised catastrophic violence. Doyle stumbled back, reaching for his pepper spray. "Get that animal back or I'll shoot it," he yelled. "I wouldn't do that," a voice said, cutting through the tension like a razor wire. Cade Nolan had materialized behind the officers. He stepped past the 2 junior officers and came to a stop beside Doyle. The sergeant spun around, instinctively raising his baton. "Back off. Police business." He made the mistake of jabbing the baton in Cade's direction. Cade moved. His left hand swept up, deflecting the strike, while his right hand clamped onto Doyle's wrist. He applied pressure to a specific nerve cluster, twisting the joint just so, a technique known as pain compliance. Doyle screamed, his knees buckled, and the baton clattered to the ground. Cade held him in place with terrifying ease. "Look around, Sergeant," Cade whispered, his gray eyes boring into Doyle's sweaty face. He cocked his head toward a pier where tourists were holding up their phones. Lots of cameras, uploading to the cloud. "You just poured hot coffee on a disabled woman and threatened assault in uniform." Cade glanced at the frightened junior officers. "You want to be on the 6 o'clock news as monsters, or do you want to pick up your stick and walk away?" Cade released the wrist. Doyle scrambled back, cradling his arm, his face contorted with rage and humiliation. He looked at the phones, then at the snarling dog. "You're making a big mistake," Doyle hissed. "Let's go." The officers retreated, leaving a silence broken only by the rustling leaves. Cade watched them until they were gone, then turned his attention to the woman in the chair. The quiet that settled over the park after the departure of Sergeant Doyle and his cronies was heavy, containing not peace but the jagged echo of adrenaline. The crowd of onlookers, having captured their digital content for the day, began to disperse with mumbled apologies and averted eyes, leaving Chief Petty Officer Cade Nolan and Clara Mae Thompson alone in the long shadows of the willows. Cade knelt beside the wheelchair, his movements shifting from the explosive violence of a warrior to the precise, clinical tenderness of a field medic. He ignored the spreading damp patch of coffee on the pavement and focused entirely on Clara. Kaiser, the massive German shepherd, remained at a sit-stay, his back to them, watching the park exit like a sentinel guarding a perimeter. Cade gently lifted away the soaked wool blanket. The coffee had seeped through her jeans, leaving the fabric steaming against her skin. "I need to check for burns," Cade said, his voice low and devoid of pity, only professional necessity. Clara nodded, her hands trembling slightly, not from pain but from the aftershocks of the humiliation. He carefully rolled up the denim cuff. The skin beneath was red and slightly blistered near the ankle, but the thick wool had absorbed most of the heat. "It's a second-degree burn, painful but not dangerous. Needs cool water and silver sulfadiazine, but it's not life-threatening," Cade assessed, pulling a small, flat first aid kit from his jacket's inner pocket. He applied a cooling gel patch he carried for K9 injuries, securing it with efficient, practiced movements. "Thank you," Clara whispered, her voice thin in the cold air. "I can manage from here. I just need to get to the train station." She reached for the chair's controller, pushing it forward. The motors hummed, but the chair lurched awkwardly to the left and stopped. Cade looked down. The left tire wasn't just flat. It was slashed open. A clean, deliberate cut through the rubber sidewall. "Grimes," Cade muttered, realizing the shorter officer must have done it while Doyle was posturing. "You're not getting to the train station," Cade said flatly, rising to his full height over the chair. "This tire is shot. You have a spare at home?" Clara stared at the ruined rubber, her shoulders slumping as the last of the fight drained out of her. "Yes, in the closet, but I live over in Ohio City. It's too far to push." Cade pulled out his phone. "I'm calling a van. We'll get you to your place." He didn't ask for permission. He simply commanded the logistics. 20 minutes later, a wheelchair-accessible taxi van pulled up to the curb. The driver, a weary-looking man named Arthur with a thick Cleveland accent and a flat cap, helped Cade secure the chair in the back. Arthur had kind eyes and asked no questions about the stone-faced man or the giant dog, nodding only when Kaiser hopped in and settled protectively beside the wheelchair clamps. The ride was quiet, the city lights beginning to flicker on as they navigated the narrow, winding streets of Ohio City, a historic neighborhood of brick townhouses and the smell of roasting garlic and oregano wafting from Italian restaurants. Clara's apartment was on the ground floor of a brownstone that had seen better days. It was a small, converted space that smelled of turpentine, old paper, and lavender. As Cade pushed her inside, he was struck by its chaotic beauty. Canvases were stacked against every wall, some finished, some in progress. There were sketches of the harbor, the skyline, and intricate studies of human hands. It was a sanctuary of creativity, a world away from the barracks and bases Cade called home. "The spare will is in the hall closet," Clara said, pointing toward a narrow door. While she wheeled herself to the tiny kitchen to make tea, Cade got to work. He shed his jacket, revealing a black t-shirt and powerfully muscled arms, and retrieved a small toolkit from the bottom of Clara's closet. For the next hour, the only sounds were the clicking of tools and the low hum of the refrigerator. Cade worked with methodical patience. He didn't just change the tire. He tightened a loose axle, greased the wheel bearings, and adjusted the footplate. He was fixing the machine, but in doing so, he was restoring her mobility, her independence. Meanwhile, Kaiser had moved from his post at the door. The shepherd, normally aloof with strangers, had walked over to where Clara sat sipping her tea. He sniffed her hand delicately, his wet nose twitching before he sighed and sank to the floor at her feet. Then he did something Cade had rarely seen. He laid his heavy, blocky head squarely on Clara's paralyzed legs. The heat from the dog's body radiated through her boots, a grounding weight that seemed to anchor her. Clara stiffened for a second, then slowly leaned down, burying her charcoal-stained fingers in the dog's thick ruff. The combat dog had detected emotional distress and appointed himself a comfort object. "He likes you," Cade said, looking up from the wheel, a rare softness in his eyes. "He usually treats civilians like furniture." Clara smiled, a genuine one that lit up her pale face. "Maybe he knows I can't run away," she joked, though the humor was dark. "He feels safe, like a mountain." She pointed to a framed sketch half hidden behind a stack of books on a low shelf. "I used to run and jump." Cade followed her gaze. It was a charcoal drawing of a ballerina in mid-flight, executing a grand jeté. The dancer's face was Clara's, but younger, unburdened by gravity. The contrast between the airborne figure in the drawing and the woman in the chair was a physical ache in the room. "The accident was 3 years ago," Clara said quietly, seeing him look. "A drunk driver ran a red light. I lost my career, my fiancé, and my legs in the space of 4 seconds. Now I draw people moving because I can't." Cade didn't offer platitudes. He didn't say, "I'm sorry," or "it'll get better." He nodded, acknowledging the loss like a casualty report. "You found a new way to fight," he said simply. "That's what matters." He finished with the wheel, spinning it to check the alignment. "Good as new." He stood and walked to the front door, frowning. The frame was cracked, the deadbolt loose in its housing. It was a landlord special. Cheap and ineffective. "This lock is a joke," Cade muttered. "You have a screwdriver and some long screws?" Clara pointed to a junk drawer. Cade spent another 20 minutes reinforcing the strike plate, driving long, 3-inch screws into the stud, turning the flimsy door into a barrier that might actually hold. Night had fully fallen outside. Streetlights cast orange stripes through the window blinds. The atmosphere in the apartment had shifted from tense to something approaching domestic comfort. Cade was packing up his tools, preparing to leave, when the sound of shattering glass ripped through the room. A brick hurtled through the front window, spraying shards across the hardwood floor. Kaiser was on his feet in a microsecond, his bark a thunderclap, planting himself between Clara and the broken window. Cade didn't freeze. He moved. He launched himself at Clara, shielding her body with his own in case a second projectile or a bullet followed. Silence followed the impact. No gunshots, just the sound of tires squealing on asphalt outside. Cade stayed low, creeping to the window and peering through the broken blinds. A dark sedan was disappearing around the corner. He stood and picked up the brick. Wrapped around it with a rubber band was a piece of paper. He unfolded it. The message was scrawled in thick black marker. "Know your place. Next time we won't miss." Clara was trembling again, staring at the jagged hole in her sanctuary. "They know where I live," she whispered, the horror fresh and raw. "Doyle." He looked up my permit application. "It has my address." Cade stared at the note, his jaw tightening until a muscle pulsed in his cheek. This wasn't just bullying anymore. It was a hunt. He looked at Clara's pale, shaking face and then at the broken window. He couldn't leave her here. Not tonight. Not with the shark circling. "I'm not going back to the hotel," Cade announced. His voice was calm, but it had the finality of a steel door slamming shut. He went to his duffel bag, which he'd brought in from the taxi, and pulled out a compact sleeping roll. Kaiser and I are staying. Clara looked at him, her eyes wide. You can't. You don't know me. This isn't your fight, Cade. Cade looked at the ballerina in the sketch, then at the woman in the chair, and finally at the note in his hand. He crumpled the paper. I'm on leave, he said, rolling out the sleeping bag on the floor beneath the window, positioning himself where he could see the door and the street. Leave is over. He gave a hand signal to Kaiser, who immediately lay down by the door, his ears pricked forward. Get some sleep, no one's coming through that door tonight. Dawn filtered through the shattered window of the Ohio City apartment, casting long, jagged shadows across the floor where Cade Nolan had spent the night in a state of semi-conscious vigilance. The window's temporary repair, a piece of plywood Cade had scrounged from the alley, obscured the view of the street, making the small room feel even more like a bunker. The air inside was thick with the smells of old paint, the metallic scent of fear, and the fresh coffee Clara was brewing in the small kitchen. She moved quietly and efficiently in her chair, her movements stiff after a restless night, while Kaiser lay near the door, his ears twitching at every passing car, a silent guardian who hadn't left his post. Cade sat at the small dining table, his object of focus not a weapon, but a thick, leather-bound sketchbook that Clara had shyly handed him as the sun came up. She wanted to show him that her art wasn't just a hobby, it was how she documented the world, a justification for her presence in the park that Doyle had tried to erase. Cade turned the pages with a reverence that seemed at odds with his calloused, dangerous hands. The drawings were remarkable, charcoal and graphite capturing the soul of Cleveland with photographic precision. He saw the weariness in a commuter's shoulders, the joy of a child feeding ducks, the architectural grace of a bridge. But as he flipped back to the entries from earlier in the week, his eyes shifted from that of an art appreciator to an intelligence gatherer. His training kicked in, the part of his brain programmed to look for anomalies, threats, and patterns. He stopped on a page dated 3 days prior. It was a wide-angle sketch of the park's periphery near the maintenance shed, a spot often ignored by tourists. In the foreground, pigeons fought over a crust of bread. In the background, in the shadow of an elm tree, 2 figures stood in conversation. One was unmistakably Sergeant Doyle. Even in charcoal, his bulk and aggressive posture were recognizable. The other was a man Cade didn't recognize, thin and sharp, handing Doyle a thick white envelope. Clara, Cade said, his voice low and tight. This drawing from Tuesday, did you see these men talking? Clara wheeled over, pouring 2 mugs of coffee. She glanced at the open book. Oh, that, yes, the sergeant meets people there sometimes. I didn't think much of it. I just liked the way the shadows fell on the bark. Cade tapped the page. Look closer. He pointed to the stranger's neck. Clara had rendered him in meticulous detail, including a distinct mark on the side of his neck just above the collar of his expensive coat. It was a scorpion, tail curled up toward the ear, drawn so clearly the segments of the arachnid were visible. I drew what I saw, she whispered, recognizing the gravity in Cade's tone. Is that important? It might be the most important thing in this room, Cade replied. He took out his phone and snapped a high-resolution photo of the sketch. I need to make a call. He stepped into the hallway for better reception, leaving the door ajar so Kaiser could still see him. He dialed a number he hadn't used in 6 months. It rang twice before a gruff, familiar voice answered, Nolan, I thought you were floating on a beach somewhere. The voice belonged to Lieutenant Ben Carter, a college friend of Cade's who had joined the Ohio State Highway Patrol instead of the Navy. Ben was a mountain of a man known for his shock of red hair, a constellation of freckles across a face that looked chiseled from a potato, and an unshakable moral compass that had made him a nightmare for local corruption. No beach, Ben, just trouble, Cade said, skipping the pleasantries. I'm sending you a photo. I need an ID on a neck tattoo. Keep it off the local net. A moment of silence hummed on the line as the image transferred. Then, a low whistle. Cade, where did you get this? Ben's voice had shifted from friendly to professional. That's a scorpion, specifically the signature tattoo of Nico Gallo. He's a mid-level distributor for the syndicate moving product through the port. We've been trying to link him to local law enforcement for a year, but the guy's a ghost. No paper trail. Cade looked back into the apartment where Clara was stroking Kaiser's head. I found your paper trail, Ben, or rather, a charcoal trail. I have a witness who saw a handoff between Gallo and a Cleveland PD sergeant named Doyle. Doyle? Ben spat the name like a curse. We've heard whispers about him. He runs that park patrol like a personal fiefdom. If he's taking envelopes from Gallo, he's not just a bad cop. He's a protected asset. Cade, listen to me. This just got dangerous. Gallo doesn't leave witnesses, and Doyle is desperate to keep his pension. You need to get me that sketchbook. Cade promised to keep him updated and hung up. He stepped back inside, the weight of the situation settling on his shoulders. This wasn't just about a bullied woman anymore. They had stumbled into a felony conspiracy. Clara, he said gently. You didn't just draw a meeting. You documented a crime. The man with the tattoo is a drug syndicate enforcer. Doyle works for him. Clara's face went white, her eyes flicking to the broken window. That's why he was so angry, she realized. He wasn't mad about the permit. He was checking to see if I saw them. Across town, in the sterile, fluorescent lit back room of the 4th Precinct, Sergeant Doyle was sweating through his uniform. He sat hunched over a computer monitor, reviewing footage from the city traffic cameras that bordered the park. He had pulled the files under the guise of investigating a vandalism complaint. His fingers drummed nervously on the desk as he scrolled through the timeline to Tuesday. There it was, the maintenance shed, the blind spot he always used, or what he thought was a blind spot. He watched himself take the envelope from Gallo. Then he switched to camera B, which covered the walkway. His heart hammered against his ribs like a trapped bird. There, sitting quietly in the background, obscured by the weeping willow, but with a clear line of sight, was the girl in the wheelchair. He zoomed in. The resolution was grainy, but the action was unmistakable. Her head bobbed up and down. She looked at him, then down at her pad. Looked at Gallo, then down at her pad. She wasn't just sitting there. She was documenting every detail. You stupid bastard, Doyle hissed under his breath, panic rising in his throat like bile. If that book got out, if anyone saw what she drew, he was finished. Prison, or worse, Gallo would find out he'd been exposed and handle it the syndicate's way. He couldn't let that happen. He needed to erase the mistake. He grabbed his personal cell phone, a burner he kept for these specific conversations, and dialed. Officer Grimes answered on the first ring. Grimes was a small man with a rodent-like face, beady eyes set too close together, and a desperate need for approval that made him willing to do whatever Doyle asked. Yeah, Sarge, Grimes answered. The brick didn't work, Grimes, Doyle said, his voice shaking with suppressed rage. And it's worse than we thought. That girl has evidence. She saw the meeting on Tuesday. A silence on the other end of the line. What do we do? Grimes asked. Doyle wiped the sweat from his brow. We're ending it tonight. No more warnings. I want that apartment gone. The book, the girl, everything. That's heavy, Sarge, Grimes stammered. There's a guy with her. That military dude. Doyle's fist tightened on the phone until the plastic creaked. Then he's collateral damage. Now listen to me. Make it look like an electrical fire. Old building, faulty wiring happens all the time. Use the accelerant we confiscated from that arson case last month. I want nothing left but ash. Do you understand me? My life is on the line, which means yours is too. Understood, Grimes said, his voice dropping to a whisper. Tonight. Doyle hung up and leaned back in his chair, staring at the frozen image of Clara on the screen. He tried to convince himself it was a necessity for survival, not murder. She was just a loose end, a mistake in the picture. He stood, adjusted his duty belt, and walked out into the precinct, putting on the mask of a fine sergeant, unaware that the countdown to his own destruction had already begun. Back at the apartment, Cade was already in motion. We can't stay here, he told Clara. Doyle is going to figure out what you have. If he checks the cameras, he'll know. Clara looked around her apartment, her art, her life. Where do we go? Cade looked at the sketchbook, then at Kaiser. We need to fortify for the night because if I know guys like Doyle, they don't wait to get caught. They try to clean up the mess. He didn't tell her that cleaning up meant burning everything to the ground, but the hard set of his jaw said it all. The transformation of Clara's apartment from an artist's sanctuary into a tactical defensive position was a quiet, methodical process that took place under the thick blanket of falling night. Cade Nolan moved through the small space not with the frantic energy of panic, but with the cold, calculated precision of a spider spinning a web. He didn't have his standard military issue equipment, no claymore mines, no trip flares, no night vision goggles. But he had the ingenuity born from a decade in special operations where adaptation was the only rule that mattered. He raided Clara's kitchen and utility drawers, gathering materials that looked harmless to the untrained eye, but which in his hands became tools of early warning and disorientation. From a stash of supplies for hanging heavy canvases, he extracted a spool of high-tensile fishing line. From the recycling bin, he retrieved half a dozen empty soup cans. This isn't to stop them at the door, Cade explained, his voice low as he knelt in the hallway. tying the fishing line to the cans which he clustered on a precarious shelf above the entryway. It's to buy seconds. Every second matters. He rigged a tripwire across the threshold, knee-high, connected to a bag of all-purpose flour he'd slit open and balanced on the doorframe. It was a crude, primitive device, but it was effective. If they breach, the flour comes down, clouds the air, blinds them for a moment, and covers them in white. In the dark, a white target is the only thing I'll need to see. Clara watched him from her wheelchair, her hands clasped around a long cold mug of tea. She felt like a stranger in her own home, watching this man dismantle her sense of normalcy to keep her alive. "You've done this before," she said, less a question than a realization of the violence he carried within him. Cade paused, testing the tension of the wire with a light flick. "Not exactly like this. Usually, I have a team. Tonight, the team is us." He turned his attention to Kaiser. The shepherd was pacing, his claws clicking a restless rhythm on the hardwood floors, sensing the change in the atmosphere. Cade called the dog over and then motioned for Clara to come closer. "Kaiser knows how to fight," Cade said, resting a hand on the massive dog's neck. "But tonight his job isn't to hunt. It's to guard. You need to know the command." He looked into Clara's eyes, his expression intense. "The word is blipe. It means stay. But to him, it means defend this position with your life. If I'm engaged, you say blipe and you point at yourself. He will not leave your side no matter what happens. Do you understand?" Clara nodded, reaching out to touch the dog's fur. "Blipe," she whispered. Kaiser's ears twitched, and he immediately pressed his flank against her wheelchair, sitting with a heavy thud, turning himself into a living shield. As the hours crawled by, the city outside grew quiet, the traffic fading to a distant hum. They sat in the darkened living room, the lights off to avoid silhouetting themselves against the windows. The only light came from the streetlights filtering through the slats of the boarded-up window. To break the suffocating tension, Cade sat on the floor, his back against the wall, his knife, a fixed-blade serrated weapon he always carried, resting on his knee. "You asked why I'm doing this," he said quietly, answering the question she hadn't spoken but which hung in the air. "There's a story we tell in the teams. There are wolves, there are sheep, and there are sheepdogs." Clara watched him, the moonlight catching the weary curve of her cheek. "And you're the sheepdog?" she asked. Cade shook his head slowly. "Most people, they want to believe the world is safe. They're the sheep. They live in denial of evil. Then there are the wolves, the ones like Doyle, the ones like Who's Coming Tonight. They prey on the sheep because they can." He paused, running his thumb along the edge of his blade. "The sheepdog has fangs like the wolf. He has the capacity for violence like the wolf, but he has a deep love for the flock. I don't do this because I enjoy the fight, I do this because I can't stand to watch the wolves feed." It was the most he'd said since they met. A glimpse into the philosophy that drove a man to sleep on a stranger's floor to fight a war that wasn't his. The clock on the microwave blinked 2:00 a.m., the witching hour. The silence in the apartment was absolute, except for the steady breathing of Kaiser. Then, it changed. A whisper-soft sound came from the front door lock. It was the distinct metallic scratch of a tension wrench being inserted into the keyway. Cade didn't move a muscle, but his entire body went rigid, coiling like a spring. He gave a sharp, single-hand gesture. "Silence." Kaiser let out a low, vibrating growl, but Cade touched the dog's snout, silencing him. The lock tumblers clicked over. The deadbolt slid back with a heavy clunk. The doorknob slowly turned. The door swung open. 3 figures stepped into the entryway, silhouetted against the hall light. They were dressed in dark clothing, their faces obscured by ski masks. The first man, stocky and moving with the aggressive gait of a brawler, stepped over the threshold. His shin hit the invisible fishing line. Crash! The cans tumbled from the shelf, a clattering cascade of metal that sounded like a gunshot in the silent apartment. Simultaneously, the bag of flour tipped, dumping its contents like a white avalanche. The lead intruder screamed in surprise, choking and sputtering as the white dust filled his eyes and nose, coating his black clothes in a ghostly pallor. "What the hell?" he yelled, blinded and disoriented. "Now," Cade whispered to himself. He reached up to the circuit breaker box on the wall beside him and threw the main lever down. The apartment plunged into absolute blackness. The intruder's night vision was ruined by the hall light and the flour. Cade, who had been sitting in the dark for hours, was perfectly adapted to the gloom. He moved. He was a shadow detaching itself from the wall. He didn't use his knife. This wasn't about killing. Not yet. It was about neutralizing. He moved into the cloud of flour, grabbing the first man by his collar and belt. Using the intruder's own momentum and confusion, Cade executed a hip throw, slamming the man onto the hardwood floor with a bone-jarring thud that knocked the wind out of him instantly. The second intruder, hearing his partner fall, swung a baseball bat wildly in the dark. "Somebody? Show yourself." It was a panicked swing. Undisciplined. Cade ducked under the arc of the bat, stepping inside the man's guard. He delivered a palm heel strike to the man's solar plexus, followed immediately by a leg sweep. The man crumpled, gasping for air that wouldn't come. Cade finished him with a precise chokehold, rendering him unconscious in 6 seconds before letting the limp body slide to the floor. The third man, who had hung back near the door, fumbled for a flashlight. The beam sliced through the darkness, illuminating the swirling dust of flour. It revealed Cade standing amidst the fallen bodies, looking like a demon risen from the fog. The light also caught the corner where Clara sat. The intruder raised a pistol. "Don't move!" he yelled, his voice shaking. It was Officer Grimes. Even through the mask, the high, desperate voice was unmistakable. He leveled the gun at Clara. "Blipe!" Clara screamed, pointing at herself as she slapped her own chest. Kaiser launched into action, but he didn't attack Grimes. He followed the command. He vaulted onto the mattress where Clara lay, putting his massive body squarely in the line of fire, shielding her completely. He barked, a ferocious, ear-splitting sound that echoed off the walls, a wall of sound and teeth protecting his charge. Grimes flinched, the pistol wavering. That moment of hesitation was all Cade needed. He closed the distance, slapping the pistol upward just as it fired. The round buried itself harmlessly in the ceiling. Cade drove his knee into Grimes's thigh, hitting the perineal nerve. Grimes's leg buckled and he collapsed, dropping the gun. Cade kicked the weapon away into the darkness and pinned Grimes to the ground, his forearm across the man's throat. "You tell Doyle," Cade whispered into Grimes's ear, his voice terrifyingly calm in the chaos, "that he just lost his pawns. Next time I'm coming for the king." He applied pressure until Grimes's eyes rolled back and he went limp. Silence returned to the apartment, broken only by Clara's fast, frightened breathing and the settling of the flour dust. Cade stood, breathing hard but uninjured. He walked to the breaker box and flipped the power back on. The scene was surreal. 3 unconscious men on the floor, covered in white powder. The room looked like a bakery had exploded. Cade went to Clara. She was pale, clutching Kaiser's fur so tightly her knuckles were white. The dog remained on her lap, growling softly at the unconscious bodies. "Are you hurt?" Cade asked, giving her a quick check. She shook her head, speechless. Cade looked at the broken door, the unconscious men, and the bullet hole in the ceiling. The element of surprise was gone. Doyle knew they were here and he knew Cade was a fighter. This wasn't a skirmish anymore. It was a war and the fortress had been breached. "We have to go," Cade said, grabbing his duffel bag. "Right now, before they come to or before Doyle sends a second wave." He looked at the chaos he had orchestrated. It was a victory, but a temporary one. They had survived the night, but they had lost their sanctuary. The air outside the brownstone was cold, a stark contrast to the stuffy, flour-filled atmosphere of the apartment they had just escaped. Cade Nolan moved with an urgency that was terrifying in its efficiency. He didn't run, because running draws attention, but his strides were long and purposeful as he guided Clara's wheelchair toward the alley where he had parked his truck. It was a 2008 Chevy Silverado painted a flat primer gray that seemed to absorb the streetlights rather than reflect them. The truck was a reflection of its owner, rugged, unremarkable, and built for utility over comfort. Cade lifted Clara into the passenger seat with a gentleness that belied the violence he'd just displayed upstairs. She felt light, fragile in his arms, shivering not just from the cold but from the shock of seeing her sanctuary violated. Kaiser hopped into the back seat without a command. He settled low, below the window line, his instincts already tuned to evasion protocol. Cade folded the wheelchair and tossed it into the truck bed, covering it with a heavy tarp before getting behind the wheel. The engine turned over with a low rumble, and they pulled away from the curb just as the distant wail of sirens began to rise, signaling that someone, likely a neighbor disturbed by the noise, had finally called the police. Clara clutched her phone, her knuckles white. "Where are we going?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "To the police station, to tell them what happened." Cade checked the rearview mirror, his eyes scanning for headlights. "No, not yet. Doyle knows he failed. He knows we have the book. He's going to flip the script." Cade steered the truck off the main roads, avoiding the bright lights of Hanover Street and heading toward the industrial maze of the waterfront district. "What do you mean?" Clara asked, glancing at him. Cade didn't answer right away. He reached over and switched on a handheld police scanner he kept in the center console. Static hissed, followed by a dispatch voice that chilled the blood. All units be advised. Suspect vehicle is a dark gray pickup truck. Suspect is a white male, military build, wanted in connection with the abduction of a disabled female, Clara Mae Thompson, from her residence in Ohio City. Suspect is to be considered armed and dangerous. Approach with extreme caution. Clara stared at the radio, horrified. Abduction? I'm right here. I'm not abducted. She reached for her phone to dial 911, but Cade gently laid his hand over the screen. Think, who's controlling dispatch right now? Who's writing the reports? Cade steered the truck down a narrow, trash-strewn alley, lights off, using the ambient city glow to see. If you call 911, they'll trace the signal. Every cop in Cleveland will descend on us. Most of them are good officers who think they're rescuing you from a maniac. They will shoot first and ask questions later because Doyle has told them I'm armed and dangerous. We can't stop until we're on solid ground. He looked at her, his expression grim. Doyle just weaponized the entire city. We're not running from 3 dirty cops anymore. We're running from the whole department. The brutal truth of it hit Clara like a physical blow. She sank back into her seat, staring out the window at the passing city she thought she knew. It had transformed into a hostile landscape. Cade drove with an intense focus. He avoided the highways, knowing the traffic cameras and license plate readers would be active. Instead, he weaved through the industrial zones of the flats and the near west side, using the shadows of warehouses and shipping containers for cover. He didn't speed. Speed drew attention. He drove the speed limit, stopped at stop signs, used his turn signals. It was the art of hiding in plain sight, of becoming just another worker heading home from a late shift. We need to go dark, Cade said. Turn your phone off. Pull the battery if you can. If not, wrap it in this. He handed her a foil-lined pouch from his glove box, a makeshift Faraday bag designed to block signals. Clara complied, her hands shaking. Cade, how do we get out of this? How do we fight a whole city? Cade guided the truck down a gravel access road that led beneath the massive concrete pylons of the Main Avenue Bridge. We don't fight the city. We let the city look for us where we aren't. We disappear. Then we choose the battlefield. The truck crunched over gravel and debris, moving deeper into the shadows under the bridge. The area was a graveyard of rusted machinery and abandoned construction barriers, smelling of salt water, diesel, and damp concrete. Above them, the bridge hummed with the sound of trucks and late-night commuters, oblivious to the drama unfolding in the darkness below. Cade guided the truck behind a massive concrete pillar that blocked the view from the main road. He cut the engine. The resulting silence was heavy, punctuated only by the rhythmic thud of tires on the bridge deck above. We stay here until the initial heat dies down, Cade whispered. They're looking for a moving vehicle. They're setting up roadblocks. We need to be a hole in the ground. He slipped out of the door silently and moved to the back of the truck. He pulled out a large, mottled gray and brown tarp, surplus military camouflage netting mixed with heavy canvas. With practiced speed, he draped it over the truck, breaking up the vehicle's lines. He threw dirt and old trash, empty cups, newspapers, over the hood and windshield to dull the glint of the glass. It was ugly but effective. From 50 yards away, the truck looked like another pile of abandoned junk under the bridge. He slid back into the driver's seat and locked the doors. Get down, he ordered softly. Floor. Clara slid from the seat, curling into the small space of the footwell. Kaiser sensed the command and went flat on the back seat, his breathing shallow and controlled. Cade reclined his own seat all the way back, disappearing below the window line. Time seemed to stretch and distort in the darkness. 10 minutes passed, then 20. The volume on the police scanner was turned to its lowest audible level, mumbling reports of roadblocks being established on I-90 and the Shoreway. Doyle was casting a wide net. Suddenly, gravel crunched nearby. Not the distant sound of traffic, but the slow, deliberate roll of tires on stone. Cade's hand went to Clara's shoulder, a silent signal to freeze. A white beam of light sliced through the gaps in the pillar, sweeping wildly across the underside of the bridge. A patrol car. It wasn't Doyle's. The markings on the side, visible for a microsecond as the light swept past, belonged to a regular beat cop checking the usual hideouts for teenagers or homeless encampments. The cruiser crept closer, its engine idling with a low rumble, its spotlight playing over the rusted machinery, the piles of trash, and then stopping on the tarp-covered mound that was their truck. Clara held her breath. She pressed her face against the gritty floor mat, her heart hammering against her ribs so hard she was sure the officer outside could hear it. The light stayed. Motes of dust danced in the white beam, illuminating the dirty canvas. If the officer got out, if he decided to poke at the pile of junk with his flashlight, it was over. Cade lay perfectly still, his eyes open, watching the play of light on the truck's ceiling. He wasn't afraid. He was calculating, distance to target 15 yards, threat level moderate. If the door opened, he would have to neutralize the officer before he could call for backup. It was a scenario he desperately wanted to avoid. In the back seat, Kaiser let out an infinitesimal whimper. A dreaming sound from a dog. Cade reached back blindly, his hand finding the dog's snout. He applied a gentle, firm pressure. Silence. Kaiser understood. The dog went rigid, holding his breath, a statue of discipline. The spotlight held for 5 more seconds. An eternity. Then the radio in the patrol car squawked loud enough to be heard through the thin metal of the truck's door. Unit 4 Alpha. Report of a disturbance at the docks. Possible B&E in progress. The officer in the cruiser sighed, the sound audible in the quiet night. The spotlight clicked off. The gravel crunched again as the patrol car backed up, turned, and drove away, its taillights fading into the darkness. Cade waited a full 2 minutes after the engine noise disappeared before he exhaled. He slowly sat up, lifting a corner of the tarp to check the perimeter. Clear, he whispered. Clara pulled herself up from the floor. Her face was streaked with dust and tears. She looked at Cade, seeing not just a soldier but a protector who navigated the darkness as easily as other people walked in the sun. That was close, she managed, her voice trembling. Too close, Cade agreed, his eyes hardening. Doyle is getting desperate. But he just made a mistake. He spread his forces too thin, looking for a ghost. Now we go on the offensive. The journey from the industrial shadows of the Main Avenue Bridge back into the heart of Ohio City was an exercise in nerve-shredding restraint. Cade Nolan drove the old Chevy Silverado with its lights off, navigating the narrow, winding streets like a ghost ship drifting through a fog. The city was asleep or pretending to be, but the air felt charged like a hunting ground. They were heading for a beacon not of light but of history. St. John's Episcopal Church, its stone steeple piercing the night sky like a warning finger raised against the darkness. It was one of the oldest standing churches in Cleveland, a place whose thick stone walls had witnessed the city's entire history. And tonight, Cade hoped it would serve as the last line of defense for another kind of war. He chose the location not just for its thick walls and defensible layout, but for the man who held its keys. Cade parked the truck in a narrow alley 2 blocks away, again covering it with the tarp in a matter of seconds. He lifted Clara into her wheelchair, which he reassembled silently and efficiently, while Kaiser stood guard at the alley's entrance, his nose twitching at the smells of damp brick and distant lake water. They moved quickly through the shadows. Cade pushed the chair over the uneven cobblestones, their passage marked only by the soft hum of the electric motors and the rhythmic click of Kaiser's nails. They reached the side door of the church, a heavy oak gate that looked strong enough to resist a battering ram. Cade knocked. 3 sharp raps, a pause, then 2 more. A moment later, the sound of a heavy bolt sliding back echoed from within. The door creaked open, revealing a sliver of warm, yellow light. Standing in the frame was Father Michael, a man who looked less like a priest and more like a retired heavyweight boxer who'd found God. He was in his late 60s with a thick shock of white hair, a nose that had been broken at least twice, and eyes that held the hard-won kindness of a man who'd heard 1,000 confessions and been shocked by none of them. He wore a simple black cassock that strained slightly at the shoulders. Cade, Father Michael said, his voice a gravelly rumble. He didn't look at the bulge of the pistol under Cade's jacket. He looked at the exhausted woman in the wheelchair and the massive German shepherd beside her. You look like you've brought the storm with you, son. I need sanctuary, Father, Cade said, his voice tight. And a phone, a landline. They're tracking cells. Father Michael stepped back immediately, ushering them inside without a single question of why or how. The church is always open to those seeking shelter. In, quickly. He bolted the door behind them, the heavy thud of the lock sliding home offering a temporary sense of security. The interior of the church was vast and silent, smelling of beeswax, old wood, and centuries of prayer. Box pews stretched in neat, ghostly white rows leading up to the high altar. It felt cut off from time, a space where the frantic violence of the streets could not penetrate. Father Michael led them to the sacristy, a small room behind the altar lined with vestments and old ledgers. On a cluttered oak desk sat a simple corded telephone. It's not secure, but it's not digital, the priest said. Do what you need to do. I'll find some blankets and food for the young lady. He placed a gentle hand on Clara's shoulder, a silent blessing, before leaving them alone. Cade picked up the receiver, the dial tone sounding like a lifeline. He dialed a number from memory, a direct line to the Ohio State Highway Patrol barracks where Ben was stationed. "Carter," the voice on the other end answered, sharp and alert. "It's me," Cade said. "Don't hang up. I'm on a secure landline." "Cade," Ben's voice dropped to a hiss. "Do you know what's happening out there? Every radio in the city is screaming your description. Kidnapping, armed assault, flight to avoid prosecution. They've got a SWAT team on standby. Where are you?" "I'm safe for the moment. And Clara is with me. She's not a hostage, Ben. She's a witness." Cade looked at Clara, who nodded firmly, her eyes clear. "I'm sending you the photos from her sketchbook right now. I'm using my cell to email them, but I'm talking on the landline so they can't pinpoint the voice signal immediately. Check your secure inbox." Cade pulled out his cell, powered it on just long enough to hit send on the draft email he'd prepared under the bridge, then immediately pulled the battery. "Got it," Ben said after 10 tense seconds. "Opening them now." There was a pause followed by a sharp intake of breath. "Holy hell, that's Nico Gallo and that's Doyle. Timestamped, this is from Tuesday." "That's right. Doyle knows we have it. That's why he torched her apartment. That's why he called in the phony kidnapping report. He's trying to kill the witness and frame a dead man. Ben, I need the cavalry, not local PD. I need state troopers or feds. If Doyle gets here first, we're dead." "I'm moving right now," Ben said, the sound of keys jingling and a chair scraping on the floor audible in the background. "I'm calling the FBI field office. We'll take jurisdiction based on the organized crime link. But Cade, I'm 20 minutes out and the feds will be longer. You need to hold." "Where are you?" "St. John's Episcopal," Cade said. "And Ben, bring heavy armor." "Hold tight, buddy. I'm coming." The line went dead. Cade hung up the phone, his hand resting on the receiver for a moment. He turned to Clara. "Help is coming. 20 minutes. Clara looked around the small room, at the crucifix on the wall and the dog sleeping at her feet. "It feels like a long time," she whispered. "In this place, time feels different." She wheeled herself out of the sacristy and into the main nave, looking up at the high ceiling. "Do you think the men who built this place ever felt this scared?" she asked. Cade came alongside her, his footsteps silent on the L runner. "They were terrified," he answered honestly. "That's what made it brave." 3 miles away, inside a patrol car parked in a dark lot behind a gas station, Sergeant Doyle watched a laptop screen with the intensity of a starving wolf. A small red dot had just blinked to life on a map. The cell trace was partial. It didn't last long enough for a precise GPS location, but it had pinged a landline registration. 2600 Church Avenue, St. John's Episcopal. Doyle stared at the address, his blood running cold. The church? Of course. The military guy had a connection there. Doyle remembered seeing something in Nolan's file about a priest mentor. But the location didn't matter as much as the implication. Nolan was on a landline. He was calling out. And since local precincts hadn't gotten a surrender call, he was calling someone else. State cops or the feds. The walls were closing in. Doyle could feel the phantom pressure of handcuffs on his wrists. Could see the news reports, the prison cell, the syndicate killers who would come for him on the inside. Panic, cold and sharp, transformed into a lethal resolve. He would not go to prison. Not tonight, not ever. He grabbed the radio on the dash. "Dispatch, this is Unit 4 Alpha," he said, his voice calm, masking the chaos in his mind. "I'm following a lead on the suspect vehicle near the Port Authority. Requesting radio silence to avoid spooking the quarry. Going dark." "Received 4 Alpha. Radio silence approved." "Good luck," the dispatcher replied, unaware she had just authorized a hit squad. Doyle killed the radio. He turned to the 2 men sitting in the car. It wasn't just Grimes and Peterson this time. He'd brought in 2 others from his payroll, dirty cops with too much to lose. But he looked at Grimes and Peterson, his core team. "We found them," Doyle said, his eyes flat and empty. "St. John's Church. They're calling the feds." Peterson blanched. "The feds? Sarge? If the FBI gets involved?" "If the FBI gets that book, we all go to prison for life," Doyle snapped. "Or Gallo kills our families. There's no more road. We end this now before the feds arrive. We go in. We neutralize the threat. We burn the book. We say Nolan opened fire and we had to put him down. The girl was collateral in the firefight." He got out of the car and went to the trunk. He popped the lid, revealing a rack filled with tactical gear meant for active shooter situations, not witness hunting. He pulled out 2 AR-15s and a tactical shotgun. He tossed a rifle to Grimes and the shotgun to Peterson. He kept the other rifle for himself, slamming a magazine home with a metallic click that echoed in the empty parking lot. "No badges," Doyle ordered. "No warnings. We're erasing." Peterson hesitated, holding the shotgun like it was a live snake. "In a church, Sarge, it's a church." Doyle got in his face, inches away. "It's a building, and inside that building is the evidence that will put you in a cell where Gallo's people will stab you in the shower. You want to pray, or you want to live?" Peterson swallowed, his Adam's apple bobbing. He tightened his grip on the shotgun. "I want to live." "Then let's go." Back inside the sanctuary, the silence was broken, not by a noise, but by Kaiser. The German shepherd, who had been resting near the altar, suddenly shot to his feet. His ears swiveled toward the heavy oak doors at the front of the church. A low, rumbling growl started deep in his chest, different from the one in the apartment. This wasn't a warning. It was a combat alert. Cade saw the change in the dog. He moved instantly to a front window, peering around the edge of a curtain. Down the street, a patrol car rolled to a silent stop, its lights off. 3 figures emerged. They weren't moving like beat cops investigating a noise. They were moving in a tactical formation, weapons drawn, heading for the side entrance. Cade turned to Father Michael and Clara. "They're here," he said, his voice flat. "And they're not coming to make an arrest." He saw the rifles. He saw the lack of flashing lights. "Father, get Clara to the crypt. Bar the door from the inside. Don't open it unless you hear my voice or Ben's." "The crypt?" Clara asked, terrified. "It's the safest place. Thick stone. Go." Cade herded them toward the back. He paused for a second, looking at the altar, then at his own empty hands. He had his knife. He had Kaiser. And he had a church full of shadows. "Kaiser," Cade commanded, his voice sharp. "Bayfuss. Heel." The dog fell in at his side. The shepherd and the soldier stood alone in the nave, waiting for the wolves to kick in the door. The heavy oak side door of St. John's Church didn't open. It exploded inward. The sound of the breach was a deafening crack that echoed off the vaulted ceiling, sending motes of dust dancing in the moonlight that streamed through the high windows. Sergeant Doyle, flanked by officers Grimes and Peterson, stepped into the nave. They were silhouettes of modern violence against a backdrop of history, their tactical lights slicing through the darkness like lasers. Doyle moved with the jerky, frantic energy of a man who had crossed a moral event horizon and knew there was no going back. He held his AR-15 low and ready, sweeping the empty rows of white box pews. The church was silent, a vast cavern of shadows and quiet that seemed to swallow their footsteps. Cade Nolan was crouched in the darkness behind the tall pulpit, his breathing controlled, his heart rate forced slow. He was unarmed in the conventional sense. His knife was sheathed, a last resort. His primary weapon was the environment itself. In the moments before the breach, he had made a calculated decision. The crypt, the original plan, was a trap. If Doyle sealed the door or tossed in a gas canister, they'd die like rats. The nave offered mobility. He had hidden Clara behind the heavy marble altar at the front of the church. It was a massive slab of stone that would stop a rifle round, providing her the only available cover. Beside her, concealed by a decorative flower urn, was the landline phone from the sacristy, which Cade had dragged out on its long cord. The receiver was off the hook. The line was open. "Nolan." Doyle's voice boomed, distorted by the sanctuary's acoustics. "I know you're in here. I saw the trace. There's no way out, soldier boy. The perimeter is locked down." He motioned for Grimes and Peterson to flank left and right, moving down the side aisles. "Come on out now and maybe we can talk a deal. You hand over the book and you walk." It was a lie, and a lazy one. Doyle had no intention of letting anyone walk. Cade remained silent, quietly shifting his position to keep the pulpit between him and Doyle's line of sight. He picked up a heavy brass candlestick, weighing it in his hand. "You're not a cop anymore, Doyle," Cade called out. His voice seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, echoing off the walls. "You're a cleaner for Nico Gallo. Does Gallo know you're this sloppy, breaking into a historic landmark, leaving a trail a mile long?" The mention of Gallo made Doyle flinch. He swept his rifle across the upper balcony, firing a short, suppressed burst that shattered a wooden balustrade. Splinters rained down. "Shut up!" Doyle yelled, his composure cracking. "You think you know what's going on? You're a tourist. You don't know this city. You don't know what keeps the peace." He stalked down the central aisle, his eyes wild. "Gallo pays for the peace. He keeps the chaos organized. And I keep the gears turning. You think you're a hero? You're just a roadblock. I'm a witness, Cade corrected, his voice calm, baiting the sergeant further. And so is the woman you burned. You tried to kill her tonight, Doyle. Arson, attempted murder, conspiracy. That's a life sentence. Or maybe the death penalty, depending on who you ask. She was a loose end, Doyle roared, abandoning all pretense of caution. He was near the front now. His voice was crystal clear to the hidden phone receiver. She was some bitch who drew the wrong picture. Nobody cares about her. Nobody cares about some welfare case and a washed-up soldier. I run this precinct. I decide who matters. The confession hung in the air, naked and damning. Every word was being piped down copper wire to the recording devices of the Ohio State Highway Patrol. Doyle had just signed his own arrest warrant. Cade prepared to move to draw fire away from the altar, but the luck had run out. Officer Peterson, moving nervously down the right-hand aisle, played his light toward the altar. The beam caught the glint of chrome, the wheel of Clara's chair. Sarge! Peterson yelled, pointing, behind the altar, I see the chair. Doyle spun, a vicious grin spreading across his face. Gotcha! He raised his rifle, aiming not at Cade but directly at the marble slab where Clara was huddled. Come on out, Nolan, or I turn your cover into a tomb. He took another step, his finger tightening on the trigger. He wasn't waiting for a surrender. He was preparing to execute. The angle was opening up. In 2 more steps, he would have a clear shot at Clara. Now! Cade yelled. The command was not for a human. From the deep shadows beneath the pulpit, a black and sable missile launched. Kaiser didn't bark. He didn't growl. He was a silent streak of kinetic energy. He cleared the communion rail in a single bound, covering the 10 feet to Doyle in a blink. Doyle saw the motion too late. He tried to swing the rifle barrel around, but Kaiser was already airborne. The shepherd's jaws locked onto Doyle's right forearm, his weapon arm, with the force of a hydraulic press. The bite was perfectly targeted, shattering the radius and ulna bones instantly. Doyle screamed. A primal, horrific sound as the rifle flew from his hands, clattering across the stone floor. The impact of the 80-pound dog hitting him at full speed knocked the sergeant off his feet, slamming him back into a pew. Kaiser did not let go. He shook his head, using his body weight to pin the man, savaging the arm to prevent any counterattack. Grimes and Peterson panicked. Grimes raised his weapon to shoot the dog. But before he could get a bead, the darkness birthed a second threat. Cade vaulted over the rail. He didn't run. He sprinted. He collided with Grimes, driving his shoulder into the man's center mass. The momentum carried them both to the floor. Cade was up first. He grabbed the barrel of Grimes's rifle, twisting it upward as it fired harmlessly into the ceiling, then delivered a precise palm heel strike to Grimes's chin, knocking him out cold. Peterson, seeing his partners neutralized in seconds, fumbled with his shotgun, his hands shaking so badly he dropped a shell. Don't, Cade said. He stood over the unconscious Grimes, breathing hard but steady, his eyes locked on Peterson. Drop it. Peterson looked at Cade, then at the screaming Doyle being held down by the snarling dog, and let the shotgun fall. He raised his hands. I surrender. Don't let the dog kill me. Doyle was still fighting, trying to reach for his sidearm with his left hand. Get it off me, you damn dog, he shrieked. Cade walked over, kicked the sidearm away, and planted a boot on Doyle's chest. Kaiser, ouse. Kaiser instantly released the arm, though he remained standing over Doyle, teeth bared, drool mixing with the sergeant's blood. Doyle curled into a ball, cradling his mangled arm, sobbing. You're dead, Nolan. Gallo will kill you. He'll kill all of you. Gallo's going to have his own problems. A booming voice announced from the main entrance. Glass shattered as the high stained glass windows were breached by repelling lines. The main doors were kicked open. Red laser dots sliced through the dusty air. Dozens of them settled on the chests of the dirty officers. Men in heavy tactical gear with state police SWAT patches swarmed the church with disciplined fury. State police. Nobody move. Get on your knees. Leading the charge was a giant of a man with red hair and a face like a slab of granite. Lieutenant Ben Carter. He held a shield in one hand and a pistol in the other. He swept the scene. Grimes unconscious, Peterson surrendering, Doyle wounded, and Cade standing in the middle of the wreckage. Take the suspects into custody, Ben bellowed. The SWAT team moved in, cuffing Peterson and pulling Doyle away from the dog. Medics followed close behind, moving toward the sergeant. Ben holstered his weapon and walked toward the altar. Cade turned and helped Clara up from behind the marble slab. She was trembling, clutching the phone receiver she had never let go of. Did you hear? She asked, her voice shaking. Ben came up, looked at the phone in her hand, then at Cade. A smile broke across his rugged face. "We heard every word, sweetheart. I run this precinct. I decide who matters. The prosecutor is going to frame that transcript." He looked at Cade and clapped a heavy hand on his shoulder. "You cut it close, buddy. 20 minutes on the dot." Cade looked at Kaiser, who had trotted over to Clara and was now licking her hand, checking her for injuries. The adrenaline was fading, leaving a cold ache in his muscles. "We had faith," Cade said, glancing at the cross above the altar. "And we had the dog." The early November wind blowing off Lake Erie had the bite of winter in it, but the sky above was a clean, cloudless blue that felt like a promise. At the end of the Voinovich Bicentennial Park Pier, where the wooden planks met the choppy gray water of the Great Lake, Clara Mae Thompson sat in a state-of-the-art, all-terrain power wheelchair. It was a sleek, matte black machine with rugged tires. A stark contrast to the old, manual chair she'd dragged through the city streets just a month earlier. The chair wasn't a charity case. It was part of a significant, court-mandated restitution settlement, paid for by the seized assets of Nico Gallo's criminal empire. But Clara wasn't looking at the chair, she was looking at the headline of the plain dealer displayed on a nearby newsstand. "Doyle ring busted. Federal investigation uncovers decade of corruption." The last 30 days had been a blur of depositions, interviews, and flashbulbs. The sketchbook, once the repository of her silent observations, had become Exhibit A in the most high-profile corruption trial in Ohio history. The recording from the church, of Doyle's voice admitting to arson and conspiracy, had been played on every news channel from CNN to the BBC. The fallout was catastrophic for the guilty and vindicating for the innocent. Sergeant Doyle was now in federal custody without bail, facing charges that would likely keep him behind bars for the rest of his life. Officers Grimes and Peterson had taken plea deals, turning state's evidence against their former boss and the syndicate connection. Even the untouchable Nico Gallo had been indicted. His operation was being dismantled by the FBI based on the intelligence Cade and Ben had provided. Clara had been hailed not as a victim, but as a whistleblower, a symbol of resilience. The mayor had personally apologized to her and the police commissioner had instituted new oversight protocols for the park patrol unit, but none of that mattered to Clara right now. Her attention was focused on the tall, broad-shouldered figure walking toward her down the pier. Chief Petty Officer Cade Nolan moved with the same predatory grace she'd noticed that first day in the park, but today he wore a thick canvas field jacket and carried a single olive-drab duffel bag over his shoulder. At his heel, matching his stride perfectly, was Kaiser. The German Shepherd looked magnificent, his coat brushed to a sheen, his eyes alert. But as they got closer, Clara noticed something different. Kaiser wasn't wearing a tactical vest. He was wearing a simple, sturdy leather collar. Cade stopped a few feet away, dropping the duffel with a heavy thud. He looked tired, the lines around his eyes a little deeper, but his expression was calm. "You look good, Clara," he said, nodding to the new chair. "Suits you. Better suspension." Clara smiled, though it didn't quite reach her eyes. She knew what this meeting was. "Much better. I can actually go over cobblestones without my teeth chattering. Ben told me you got your orders." Cade nodded, looking out at the horizon where a gray naval transport ship was visible in the distance. "Orders came in early. I fly to Virginia in 2 hours, then to a staging area. It's a long rotation this time." The silence that stretched between them was heavy with things unsaid. In the short, violent span of time they'd known each other, they had forged a bond that usually took years to build. They had been in the trenches together, literally and figuratively. "I wanted to thank you," Clara said, her voice wavering slightly. "For everything, for the tire, for the apartment, for saving my life in the church. I don't know how to repay you." Cade shook his head, dismissing the debt. "You saved yourself, you documented the truth. You held your ground when they broke down the door. I just provided supporting fire." He crouched down, bringing himself to her eye level. "But we need to talk about Kaiser." Clara looked at the dog. Kaiser was now sitting, but he was leaning his weight against her leg, his head resting near her knee. It was a familiar, proprietary gesture. "He's going to miss you terribly," Clara said quietly. "I'll miss him too. He's a good soldier." Cade reached out and scratched the dog behind the ears, a look of deep sadness and pride on his face. "He was a good soldier, but he's retired now." Clara frowned, confused. "Retired?" "Ben said he was just waiting for orders." "I thought where you go, he goes." "He used to," Cade said, standing up. "But a military working dog is only effective if his head is in the mission. If his focus is absolute." He pointed at Kaiser, who hadn't looked at Cade once since they stopped. The dog's eyes were fixed on Clara, watching her hand movements, observing her perimeter. Ever since that night in the apartment, ever since he shielded you from Grimes, his mission changed. He's not watching my back anymore, Clara. He's watching yours. Cade reached into his jacket, pulling out a folded piece of paperwork and a heavy leather leash. I pulled some strings, called in every favor I had with the kennel master and the JAG officers. Kaiser has been honorably discharged. Classification: medical retirement due to a change in temperament. It's a lie on paper, but it's effective. He held the leash out to her. Clara stared at it, her heart pounding. Cade. I can't. He's your partner. He's your family. He chose you, Cade said, his voice raw with an emotion he was trying to suppress. In the apartment when you gave the command, in the church when he launched at Doyle, he wasn't following my orders, he was protecting his pack. You're his pack now. He stepped closer and clipped the leash to Kaiser's collar. Then he rested his hand on the dog's head, leaning down to whisper something in his ear, a private and final goodbye. He stood up straight, squaring his shoulders. I go places where bad things happen. I need to know that while I'm gone, something good over here is safe. He needs a home. He needs peace. And frankly, I think you need a sheepdog. Tears spilled over Clara's cheeks, hot and fast. She reached out and took the leash. It felt heavy, a physical connection to the life-saving force beside her. I'll take care of him, she promised. I swear, Cade, he will be the most loved dog in Cleveland. I know, Cade said. He checked his watch. I have to go. He didn't hug. That wasn't his way. He reached out, enclosing her hand in a firm, warm grip. Watch your six, Thompson. Stay safe, Ryder, she replied, using his call sign for the first time. Cade turned and picked up his bag. He walked away without looking back. That was the SEAL discipline. Looking back makes you hesitate, and hesitation gets you killed. But as he walked down the long wooden pier toward the waiting transport, his steps felt lighter. He was going back to war. Yes, but he was leaving a piece of his peace in good hands. Clara watched him go until he was just a silhouette against the sun. She looked down. Kaiser sat beside her, his body pressed against the wheel of her new chair. He wasn't looking at Cade. He was looking up at her, his amber eyes bright and attentive, his tail giving a single, slow thump against the deck. He nudged her hand with his wet nose. Okay, Kaiser, Clara whispered, wiping her tears and taking the joystick of her chair. Let's go home. She turned the chair, the electric motors humming softly. As they left the pier and headed back toward the city skyline, the massive German Shepherd walked beside her, not at a soldier's heel, but at a friend's side. The nightmare was over. Winter was coming, but for the first time in years, Clara Mae Thompson wasn't afraid of the cold. She had a new guardian, a new strength, and a new dawn waiting just over the horizon.